Hello and welcome. Today's video will be about how to reverse an axle on these new gearboxes. Originally, when they come out of the toys, you're able to wind them clockwise. And I'm going to show you how to reverse the axle and be able to wind the gearbox counterclockwise, just in case you run into a toy that requires a counterclockwise winding gearbox. So let's go ahead and get started. So the gearbox I'll be performing this procedure on is coming out of the toys that walk. The toys that walk have that protruding axle out of gear 2, and they have two offset knobs that rotate or counter rotate from each other. So the first step would be to remove them, and then I'll go ahead and remove the winding knob from the main axle. So now that we've removed the knobs off of this gearbox, we're going to go ahead and take an X-Acto knife and use the sharp end to get in between the seal of the divider, the housing divider, and the housing spring cover of this gearbox. Once you have enough of it pried open, you can go ahead and pull it apart with your hands, and just be careful, because you never know what's going to happen. So at this point, you can go ahead and extract the spring and set it aside. And let's go ahead and remove the housing divider and get to reversing this axle. Once you're able to remove the housing divider, put it aside. Here in my hand, I have gear 1, or the spur gear. This is gear 2. This is the S-spring gear and main gear with axle. This is gear 3. And last but not least, the C gear, or caging gear. Now let's get to reversing this axle. What you need to know is that when you're removing an axle, or the spring gear from an axle, you must find a hole. In this case, I'm using the space in between the snips that I have on there to be able to hammer out the S-spring gear from the axle. Now I have to use the flat side to be able to force it out. Never try to force it out from its ears on the other side. As you can see here, there's a raised area on the axle where the S-spring gear grabs onto. Let's go ahead and remove it, turn it around, and then place it back on the axle. In effect, we just flipped the S-spring gear on the axle. Now all we have to do is simply hammer it back in, but with a light touch. Using the hole again that I have on my snips, I'll go ahead and insert the axle and let the flat end of the S-spring gear rest upon the side of the snips, and then hammer it into place. I'll show you what happens if you hammer it too hard. The axle will simply slip right past the mounting point. So let's try it again with a lighter touch. Resting the flat side, as before, against the snips. Hammer lightly and remount the S-spring gear onto the axle. And there you have it. We have successfully flipped our S-spring gear. Now the gearbox will be able to wind counterclockwise. So to recap, to be able to extract the S-spring gear from its axle, you must place the flat end of the S-spring gear and not its ears upon a hard surface in order to extract it. And when you flip it, as shown in the photo here, the one on the bottom winds counterclockwise, the one on top is clockwise. That would be the difference between them after you've completed the modifications to them. After checking everything out, it's time we start the reassembly of this gearbox. We can begin by placing in gear 2, which fits in the middle of the gearbox. Main gear and S-spring gear follow. And we'll go ahead and put gear 1, or the spur gear, that goes above gear 2. Gear 3 will follow beside it. And usually when I'm rebuilding these gearboxes, I usually put the C gear in after gear 3. But in this case, the C gear has its own mounting point on the other side of the housing divider. It's a new thing that they have with these new gearboxes. So I'll go ahead and mount it onto the housing divider and then place it on top of the bottom half of the gear housing cover. Okay, this part of the assembly went well. Testing out the gears. They feel like they're interacting well. Next part will be to place the spring inside the gearbox. Putting the gearbox aside, let's go ahead and take our tweezers and take out the inside coil and unwind it. That way it'll be more manageable when we remount it into the gearbox. Now, once you get the correct orientation of the spring onto the gearbox, go ahead and mount it onto the axle, making sure the spring is interacting with both ears on the S-spring gear. And then the rest of the spring, go ahead and let it protrude out from the two little forks that are located on the outer edge of the housing divider. It must look like this before you mount the housing spring cover upon it. Now that we have a successful merging of the housing spring cover, which completed the gearbox, we'll go ahead and wind it up counterclockwise. This part is fairly simple. Simply turn the gearbox in the direction of where the spring is coming out from, and you'll always get it right. Turn the gearbox in the direction of the spring, and the spring will slowly go into the gearbox as you wind it up. So now we have a functioning gearbox that winds counterclockwise and unwinds in a clockwise direction. This is very handy again for a toy that has a gearbox that winds counterclockwise and unwinds clockwise. So this gearbox is almost done, and since I'm sending it to a friend, I'm going to go ahead and cut down the portions that they won't need. That way when they get it, they can go ahead and fit it into their own toy. So this gearbox is done and ready for shipment. Next we'll move on to the S-spring gear and main gear harvesting from another gearbox. So for this portion of the video, I'm going to show you what the unaltered gearbox looks like when it's unwinding, and then what the altered gearbox looks like when it unwinds. So this gearbox is unaltered, and it unwinds in a counterclockwise direction. This gearbox has been altered. It winds in a counterclockwise direction and unwinds in a clockwise direction. It's a little confusing, but it does work. Now, this is the toy that hops where I got this gearbox from. The toys that hop have a gearbox that just lets go of its energy once it's been wound. These are the gearboxes that I prefer to harvest an S-spring gear and main gear with axle from them. Let's go ahead and do that now. Now, just as the same procedure as before, go ahead and remove the knob from the main axle with the snips. And let's go ahead and take an X-Acto knife. Well, let me remove this little knob. And we'll go ahead and take our X-Acto knife, place the sharp end in between the seams of the housing divider and the housing spring cover, and slowly pry it apart. Once you've pried it apart enough, you can go ahead and separate it with your fingers. Just be careful. Whoops. Well, I'd like to show you how this gearbox works, if I can find all the pieces. But so far we've successfully extracted the S-spring gear with main axle and the main gear, which are the parts I usually harvest from these gearboxes to begin with. The rest of it is gravy. The spring can be used as a replacement for a different gearbox, for some other toy. There's gear 2, I found it. Gears 2 and 3 can be used for other gearboxes, and that's pretty much what I use them for. Just to harvest them for repair of the S-spring gear. And to remind you that the S-spring gear and main gear from these gearboxes does fit inside the old gearboxes of the Starcom toys. So you can just go ahead and flat out replace them without extracting them from the axle, unless you choose to do so. I've done this in other videos, but I haven't gone in depth into how to do it and what I actually use them for, or how I use them. Hopefully this video was successfully useful for you all, and thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next video.